Okay.
So
Yes.
where were we?
Where were so you're saying that the relationship was quite different in China when you had Angus as a small baby.
Yes, well, it was not any different from my mother's experience, but it also it changed completely when we were back again later. Our first time in China, when Angus was a baby, the servants were part of a team. They reckoned that they were there, and we as the parents and the children, and they, as the people looking after us, were all part of a team, and it was a very friendly experience. We had an ayah who was enchanting, old-fashioned. She was charming. I don't remember her name. We called her ayah, I think, wasn't it? And she was very much in the shape and in the same sense as my mother's ayah, although of course China was not the friendly place even then that Ceylon had been as part of the British Empire.
And she looked after Angus?
She looked after Angus as a baby. And I've got on film somewhere some very loving scenes where she is putting him onto a toy horse or something, or carrying him.
And how did you interact with her?
Well, she didn't speak much English, and I certainly didn't speak very much Chinese, but enough to manage. It was great. She had a husband who was our cook, a very large, Our Yip was the head boy. He was the cook.
Wang Shifu or Da Shifu?
Da Shifu, yeah. Da Shifu. And he was very Da, which means big in Chinese. Big fat man who didn't care for me to come into his kitchen at all. And I'd hoped very much that I would be able to learn how to cook the delicious Chinese food that he used to make for us. Both Alan and I loved Chinese food. But he
wouldn't let you in?
No, well, I got as far as the door, and then he said, no, when it's too difficult, and no, I'm sorry. In his Chinese way, he said, I'm sorry, but no, I can't show you. Anyway, that was the first time.
And where was he getting his food? I mean, he would buy the groceries himself, or you would say, we want this?
Yes, he would buy. He would buy some, but I did some of the buying too, which meant that I had to have enough Chinese to be able to ask for what I wanted. But I'm getting a bit confused in my memories because it did change so much when we were back again. We never went back to that lovely house, unfortunately. But we did have...
But when you were in the residence, it was very different.
It was completely different, yes.
And why so different?
Well, because in fact they were basically all the servants, when we were in the residence, were not, as it were, part of our family. They were spies for the government. They were allowed to come, and we paid them extremely well. The association that actually handed out servants to diplomats made quite sure that they made a lot of money out of them. I don't think the servants got very much, but we paid I can't now remember the name of the organisation which actually delivered them. But we were lucky that we actually had ones that could cook, more or less, and look after. When we were in the residence, of course, we didn't have small children. We had grown-up children there then. And an ayah was actually a spy. I caught one who was meant to be cleaning, but as actually looking through the wastepaper basket and picking out the papers that Alan had discarded in case there was something there that might be of interest to the organisation that ran the diplomats.
And so were you able to fire them, or they were just there?
We could have fired them, And there were various other ambassadors' wives who did fire their gardeners, their cooks, their everything else, and then found that in fact that um, this association, government section that actually dealt with servants for diplomats would actually give them who was going to, if they fired their cook, they would be given another cook. And she went through an awful lot of cooks and then found that very often they were ex-gardeners from some other diplomatic family or something, or not necessarily people that could cook at all. We actually always hung on to ours. We had, in fact, 2 teams of servants because when we went back as Alan was the ambassador there, we needed to be able to cover a day from at least 7 o'clock in the morning until 11 o'clock at night, because our house was very often used as the place where visitors from Britain who might be coming out would want to stay with the ambassador, and therefore early morning tea needed to be provided, as well as, you know, late night drinks in the evening. And that meant at that stage the directorate that sort of dealt with servants said they can't work more than 8 hours, and therefore if you want them from 7 o'clock we've got to have 2 teams. So when we were back, we had 2 complete teams of servants from ones that actually dealt with in the household or in the kitchen.
And what were they like? I mean, were they friendly?
No, well, no, not really. They couldn't be. They weren't allowed to be. Their job there was like this. The girl that was meant to be just cleaning was looking for anything that might be of interest to the directorate. I can't now remember the name of the
Doesn't matter.
organisation that dealt with servants for diplomats. But, you know, they were looking for anything that might be of interest to the government department. Anyway.
And how did that contrast with Hong Kong? So in Hong Kong there was
Hong Kong.
Ah Yip and Ah Soo, who were living in in Mount Kellett Road. What about them?
Oh, well then, much earlier. That was a real team. They were lovely. Ah Soo was the armour, wasn't she? And Ah Yip was the cook and head boy. He wasn't a great cook for Chinese food. In fact, it was his wife that made Chinese food, if we wanted it. But he did cook as well as he could. I never forget Christmas Day, and I'm sure the family will remember it, when we had, of course, a turkey. And we asked him if he knew how to roast it. Oh yes, of course he did. He'd been cooking for foreigners, you know, for Christmas forever. And so I didn't interfere in the kitchen at all. And we all gathered round the table, as I'm sure the boys will remember. And at the time came for the turkey, in on the trolley was wheeled this magnificent turkey, wired up with electricity, so that the lights in his eyes flashed on and off, his head still on the body, or reattached to the body, bowed up and down as he went, and his tail was also fluctuating at the back. And we stared at this incredible object, and luckily, I think it must have been John, who burst into clapping of applause, which we all luckily joined in. And Ah Yip was absolutely delighted. And of course, eventually, everything was disengaged and disentangled and the electricity was removed. But I don't think any of us will ever forget the astonishment with which we met this wired-up electrical turkey coming in, bowing and flashing his eyes before we were allowed to actually eat it. He was a lovely man.
And how about the au pair girls or the other ones looking after the young children in France or at other times? You know, there's quite a few au pairs coming through, weren't there?
Well, I'm just trying to remember France.
Where was Nancy?
We had Nancy, that's right. She was a lovely nanny. And she'd been, she'd tried to get a job with another diplomatic family, but had been rejected in favour of a different one, and so she was, as it were, free She was Scottish, and she was absolutely superb. And not only was she very good for us in France, but when we were going to Paris and going to Peking, I said to her, would she like to come? And she said yes. And she came. And was with us for our first tour there, but she didn't come for a second one. And no one here was ever as good again. She was a lovely Scottish girl. Nancy, do you remember Nancy?
Not really. Then how about in Hong Kong? There was a girl who travelled around Southeast Asia eating a clove of garlic a day, and that kept her healthy. And then she came as a nanny in Hong Kong. Do you remember who? And she's since married some diplomat, I think.
Yes, that's right.
Who was that?
I can't at the moment remember her name, it will come, but she did marry a diplomat. When she first came to us, he was a boyfriend and she was visiting him in Hong Kong, which is why she was free to come and do nannying for me. But she ended up as being, doing the job that I was doing. Her husband, who was a Chinese speaker, became the ambassador in turn, I mean much later on, but in China, and she was the ambassador's wife in China. Unfortunately for her, she didn't have anything like such a nice time as I did, because when Alan was the ambassador, I had a role to play in dinner parties and meeting guests and having, being a hostess. And by the time that she became an ambassador's wife, all the business that the ambassadors did tended to be commercial and was done in restaurants in the city, so that in fact the residence itself was not a place of hospitality in the way that it had been when I was there. And so she felt very cut out and very sort of left alone, while her husband went off with all the business contacts and things and did his job in restaurants. So I was extremely lucky. Every time I've been incredibly lucky to be in interesting places at times when it was possible to get there. For example, going to Mongolia, I had the luck to go to Mongolia at a time when it was only just emerging into the world. That's just an example, and a fantastic train journey that went from Peking all the way up, and had to change trains, change wheels on the train, and saw the most magnificent landscapes and things, and having to live in 2 suites of a terrible hotel, an awful hotel in Mongolia in the early days, where it was still rather Russian orientated, and so there was a lady on every level of the hotel, the only one hotel, and on every level there was a lady who checked who went in and out of the houses, with the doors, and where the only food was boiled mutton, and the smell of boiled mutton went, all the way through the hotel. It was terrible. Luckily, we had brought up a fortnight's supply of food, some of it fresh, some of it frozen, some of it tinned. So we managed to avoid having it. We tried the mutton once and decided never again.
And how about Indonesia? Do you remember your team in Indonesia? It was Dedi, was it? And who were the other
we had
ones?
a wonderful team. That was the happiest place. It wasn't the most important place for Alan, and the most interesting. He loved it, but it wasn't the most important. China was that in his career, but it certainly was our happiest posting, partly because we had a team of servants who were absolutely wonderful. They, like the ones way back when we were young in Peking, they considered that they were part of a team, they were part of our family, and that it was important that how the outside world and all the other people that we knew and met frequently in Jakarta should see us as them and us, our servants, like, what was he called? Andre? No, who was the driver?
I can't remember the driver. I think Dedi was the head boy.
Dedi.
Was Dedi the driver? I can't remember.
Dedi was also the driver. Yes, he spoke. He was Christian,
Yeah.
Unlike the rest of them who were all Muslims and things. And he was our driver. Yes, that's right.
And in terms of the cook then, the cook was Muslim, but he was frying bacon, or?
Yes, oh yes, he was able to do that. He was a lovely man, large, fat, can't remember his name. It is awful when your memory goes. But he was a sweetheart. And they all worked together as a team and with us. So there was not the awful sort of wrinkles and difficulties when we actually left Indonesia to be cross-posted to Peking. The change between one residence and the next and how it ran was absolutely as sharp as day and night. It was extremely difficult in Peking and had been incredibly easy and friendly in Indonesia. Indonesia was a lovely place.
Great. I'm just going to put that on pause for a minute.